A quick warning before we start. This video will include drawings, photos and footage of people suffering from smallpox. So if you think that is likely to distress you, then this video maybe isn't for you. It was one of the deadliest diseases in history, and yet we managed to beat it. The story of how smallpox was eradicated is one of humanity's greatest achievements, and in today's video from History Calling, I'm going to tell you how it was done. I'll start with an overview of this horrendous disease, including a discussion of its symptoms and mortality rates, some famous victims of it, and the long-term damage it could do to those who managed to survive it. I'll then tell you how a smallpox vaccine was invented, the rather repulsive yet mostly effective ways it had to be delivered in the early days, the contribution that cows made to the whole endeavour, yes, cows, whether I think it could ever come back, and what would happen if it did. We have evidence for the existence of smallpox dating back to ancient times, though the debate continues as to when it actually emerged. The earliest reliable descriptions we have of it come from Indian texts which had been written by the 1st to 4th centuries AD, but which may have been in existence much earlier, perhaps as far back as the 15th century BC. There is also a description of smallpox in China dating to the 4th century AD, and it is often asserted that Egyptian pharaoh Ramses V, who died all the way back in 1157 BC, was killed by smallpox because of face lesions seen on his mummified body. This image shows the lesions in question, though they could have been the result of some other illness, so this evidence is not conclusive. The disease had certainly made it to Europe by the 6th century AD, though again there is some evidence it may have been there much earlier, and was possibly the plague of Athens of the 5th century BC. It was taken to the Americas through colonization in the 16th century AD, and I'll be telling you the story of one of America's bad outbreaks a little later in the video. Smallpox, which is more technically called the variola virus, affected only humans and almost always passed from host to host through interpersonal contact. That meant that it needed a large population centre to stay active. In small population centres, it would basically burn out after it had infected everyone available, as the infected would either die or survive and have lifelong immunity. It could only thrive and become endemic in large population groups, roughly 200,000 people plus, where new children were being born on a regular basis, thereby providing a constant source of new hosts. There were two types of smallpox. Variola major was the more severe, variola minor was much less so. It is no exaggeration to say that this was one of the most feared illnesses in history, despite stiff competition from the likes of the plague. The symptoms of smallpox were horrific, and its mortality rate devastating. It would first incubate for an average of 10 to 12 days, during which the infected person seemed perfectly healthy and was not infectious. Then a fever would emerge, alongside malaise, a sore head and back, and sometimes vomiting and diarrhea. This would last between 1 and 4 days, and the person was now infectious. Next came the most famous of its symptoms, the rash. This could be over the patient's entire body, though the face, arms and legs usually saw the greatest concentration, and it was horrendous. These painful, pus-filled lesions were full of virus and, assuming a patient survived, would last up to 4 weeks until they scabbed and fell off, at which point the patient was no longer infectious. If one did live, scarring, blindness and infertility were just some of the long-term effects that could afflict you, as you can see in this image of a woman with severe facial marks and who had lost her sight to the disease. Many didn't even make it this far though, instead succumbing to the illness. I've seen differing mortality rates, in part due to the fact that it could differ from country to country and case rates weren't always well reported, but we're talking somewhere in the order of 20 to 40% for variola major and 1% for variola minor. Smallpox was killing 400,000 people a year in Europe alone in the 18th century, and it didn't discriminate in who it attacked. Some of history's most famous faces were killed or pockmarked by this disease. Queen Elizabeth I of England came down with it in 1562, for instance, when she was 29 years old. The treatment administered to her of wrapping her in red cloth will have done nothing to help, but she survived anyway, albeit with some scarring. 132 years later, Mary II was not so lucky. She died of the disease in December 1694, aged only 32. In France in 1711, it killed the Grand Dauphin, who was the eldest son of Louis XIV and the heir to the throne. So how did we finally get on top of this disease and ultimately wipe it from the face of the earth? The short answer is vaccination. Before I get into detail on that though, if you're enjoying this content, please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel with the notification bell switched on so that YouTube lets you know when I upload. For more from History Calling, you can also find me on Patreon, where I share perks including early access to videos and mini podcasts, and I also have an Amazon storefront which you might like to check out. I've listed various products there, usually history themed, which you might be interested in. These two sites, plus my Instagram page, are linked in the description box below for you. Thank you to everyone who already supports me by using them, and to those of you who make one-off donations to the channel using the thanks button underneath videos. Smallpox vaccines were actually discovered and used in India and China as early as the 11th and 12th centuries. They weren't like the super hygienic jabs we get in our doctors' offices today though. These people practiced something called variolation. Remember, smallpox's official name is variola virus. This entailed extracting the pus from a smallpox sufferer's lesions and using it to infect a new person, often through a small incision in the arm. This image actually dates to the 19th century, but it shows the same procedure, and I must thank one of my friends who's Chinese for translating the text here to confirm for me that it was discussing the correct procedure. He knows who he is. In China, one could also be immunized by having ground up smallpox scabs blown up your nostrils. I did promise you at the start of the video that some of these early immunization techniques were not very pleasant. The practice would cause the person inoculated to develop smallpox, but typically a much less severe case of it, which could be survived. The mortality rate was still 1 to 2%, which would be completely unacceptable by today's standards, but compared to the roughly 1 in 3 death rate of full-blown smallpox, it was by far the most preferable option, and the practice spread throughout Asia and Africa. Europeans were a lot slower to catch on, but one of the earliest instances of someone who did appreciate the benefits of variolation was Lady Mary Wortley Montagu of England. She had survived smallpox but had been scarred and had seen her brother die of it. In 1716, her husband became the British ambassador to Istanbul, then called Constantinople, and so she travelled to the Ottoman Empire. There, she observed the practice of ingrafting, as it was known locally, and decided to have it carried out on her young son, Edward, in 1718. It was a success. She later returned home to England, and when there was a smallpox outbreak there in 1721, she had her daughter inoculated too, the first time we know of that this procedure was carried out in Britain. There was considerable resistance to the idea amongst both the medical profession and the general public, partly based on fear, partly on xenophobia of what was seen as an Oriental practice. Lady Mary was loudly criticised in many quarters, but as her acquaintances saw her little girl recover well, it slowly gained a following. In August that same year, at Newgate Prison in London, a group of prisoners facing execution were offered the chance of inoculation instead, with the promise of freedom if they lived. All accepted, all survived, and one was deliberately exposed to smallpox afterwards to demonstrate that she was now immune. Still, many people refused to be vaccinated, but there were some high-profile supporters of the practice, including Caroline, Princess of Wales, later Queen Caroline, who had her children inoculated too, though her support and that of Lady Mary were often played down because they were women. Sadly, Caroline still died a horrible death, thanks to the many other deficits in 18th century medicine, which you can learn more about in my video on her horrific demise, linked on screen and below for you. Over in Boston, Massachusetts, variolation was also trialled in 1721 during a severe smallpox outbreak. It was championed by the Reverend Cotton Mather, a Puritan minister who had read about its use in Turkey and heard about it directly from his African slave Onesimus, who had undergone it before his enslavement and said that it was commonplace in his tribe. Many of the doctors Mather approached to conduct an inoculation trial with him were uninterested, but he enlisted the support of Zabdiel Boylston, and on the 26th of June, 1721, with the epidemic already well underway, he inoculated his 6-year-old son, his 36-year-old slave, and his slave's 2-year-old son. All 3 survived and thrived, despite having been experimented on without their consent, not that they were in a position to give informed consent given their status as children and/or slaves. I suppose I should say that Boylston had already had the disease, so he couldn't experiment on himself, though even if he could have done, I wouldn't be surprised if he'd still preferred to use his slaves. There was a huge backlash against this experiment, despite its success, for as far as the locals were concerned, he'd infected 3 people with a deadly disease which they might have died from or passed on to others, and there was a mistrust of foreign medicine. Boylston's life was in danger from retribution, but he continued to inoculate more people, and the hysteria amongst his opponents intensified. In the end, he did have to discontinue his efforts, but he'd shown that in that particular outbreak, inoculation had a 2% death risk as opposed to 15% for naturally acquired smallpox, and humanity was one step further along the road to widespread vaccination. The next significant advancements in the story of the smallpox vaccine came in the 1770s, 1780s, and 1790s. In 1774, Benjamin Jesty, an English farmer from Dorset, had noticed that those who caught cowpox, including himself, never caught smallpox, and so when the latter came to his town, he resolved to protect his wife and sons by inoculating them with cowpox. He put some scratches on their arms and transferred cowpox matter to them. All recovered, though his wife was very poorly for a time, and never contracted smallpox. Jesty's findings were not well disseminated, however, and so he is sometimes overlooked in the history of smallpox. It was only when his results were replicated by English doctor Edward Jenner that people really took notice. In 1796, Jenner carried out a cowpox inoculation on an 8-year-old boy called James Phipps, using biological material taken from a dairymaid called Sarah Nelms. 6 weeks later, little James had recovered, and most importantly of all, proved immune to variolation with smallpox. It goes without saying that just like in Boston 75 years earlier, there were no ethical boards to prevent experimentation on children. Jenner carried out more experiments in 1798 and then published his findings. They were considered groundbreaking. Here was a safer way to inoculate against smallpox than variolation. The new procedure was called vaccination after the Latin word vacca, meaning cow. The cow, by the way, which had been the source of the cowpox, was called Blossom and became something of a celebrity. Its hide is now in St George's Hospital Medical School, and there's a portrait of her in the Royal College of Pathologists. As for Jesty, he did earn some recognition from the Vaccine Pock Institute in 1805, who gave him a testimonial and a pair of gold-mounted lancets in recognition of his work. They also had this portrait of him painted, and as you can see, his gravestone also commemorates his contribution to the fight against the disease. Incidentally, there is a story that a Dr. John Fuster had given a paper to the Medical Society of London about the connection between cowpox and smallpox back in 1765. However, according to that society's own website, it wasn't founded until 1773, so that story must be an error. Even after Jenner's publications on his work, there was still resistance to the idea of inoculation, as you can see in this image, which depicts people being vaccinated and then developing some of the features of cows. Ridiculous when you consider that humans had been catching full-blown cowpox for centuries and not transforming into bovines, but it just shows that scaremongering and misinformation are not new phenomena. Over time, this immunization technique was further refined so that human-to-human or cow-to-human transmissions were no longer necessary. Instead, a more hygienic vaccine could be produced en masse in labs. Such was the procedure's evident success that it became compulsory in much of the US during the 1840s and 1850s. From 1855 on, for instance, children in Massachusetts had to be vaccinated before they could go to school, and immunization of infants had been made the law in the United Kingdom in 1853. However, conscientious objection was allowed there from 1898 and made easier to claim from 1907, and this undercut the vaccine programme. World War I caused a resurgence in cases, and in 1919 there were 300,000 cases in Europe. But overall, the trend was a downward one, and smallpox became rarer and rarer in the developed world. When there were outbreaks, such as one in Glasgow in 1950, around 300,000 people rushed to be vaccinated. European flare-ups now tended to be caused by the increasing amount of travel seen during the 20th century, as more and more people flew in particular. But thankfully, they were able to be contained with few deaths, and it became increasingly common in some places to demand certificates proving that one had been vaccinated before you were allowed out of one country and into the next. By 1953, the disease had been eliminated from Europe and North America and some small Asian countries, but it remained a serious problem in Africa and other parts of Asia. Australasia and Scandinavia had managed to control it earlier because of excellent vaccine programs, quarantine procedures, and in the case of places like Australia and New Zealand, the sheer distance they were at from other major population centres. The mass vaccination of infants was halted in the UK in 1971, and routine vaccinations were ceased in the United States in 1972. The World Health Organization, also known as the WHO for short, despite some previous reticence, turned its attention to the possibility of totally eradicating the disease in 1958 by mass vaccinations in affected countries, and therefore the achievement of herd immunity so that the virus's chain of transmission would be broken once and for all. The programme did have some considerable successes, and some more countries were freed from the disease. But by 1966, it was clear that this approach wasn't going to bring about its total elimination. It was still endemic in 31 countries, with 20 million cases and 2 million deaths per year. Despite the provision of freeze-dried vaccines, many countries still used a liquid dose, and the tropical environmental conditions which prevailed in places like sub-Saharan Africa dramatically decreased its potency due to poor storage conditions. The WHO now agreed to pay to coordinate the vaccine programs, which they had held off doing before, and in 1967 the intensified smallpox eradication program was set up, overseen by the Smallpox Eradication Unit at the WHO in Geneva. It oversaw a massive upscaling in quality control of vaccines, as well as the quantities sent out. It also took a slightly different approach, not just using widespread vaccinations, but also a system of surveillance and containment. When a case of smallpox was detected, all that person's contacts were immediately vaccinated in order to contain the virus. This was especially useful if done very fast, as the vaccine could either prevent someone recently exposed from becoming ill or substantially decrease the severity of their illness. The results of this approach were astounding. Within a decade, smallpox was defeated. The last ever case was in Somalia in 1977, and the man in question made a full recovery, and it was declared eradicated by the WHO in 1980. Today, only 2 samples of live smallpox vaccine remain in the world, one in the United States, one in Russia. I'm going to finish this video by discussing what I think would happen if it hypothetically ever got out again, and the likelihood of that occurring. If smallpox were to escape its laboratory confinements now, I think it would be a near unprecedented disaster. We're talking far worse than the recent incident, which is what I'm calling it, as I don't think YouTube likes creators saying the actual name of it, with the nearest possible comparison, in my opinion, being the 1918 flu. Almost no one has been vaccinated since the 1970s at the latest, and vaccine resistance has worn off in many, if not most of those who had it in the first place. For as the website of the Centre for Disease Control says, quote, smallpox vaccination can protect you from smallpox for about 3 to 5 years. After that time, its ability to protect you decreases. Therefore, even if you have been immunised, you likely have little or no immunity today. There are also increasingly few people who acquired lifelong immunity through contracting and surviving the illness, and most of those would be in Africa and Asia, the last hotspots for the virus. The speed at which it would spread with modern travel habits would also be terrifying. As we all know, it only took a couple of months for the recent incident to go from patient zero to a worldwide crisis, and its mortality rate was nowhere near as high as variola majors. Dear forbid then that this disease was ever released back into the wild, for it would have a virtually blank slate to work with and could cross international borders with ease. Most doctors have never even seen it and may not immediately know how to diagnose it, and its mortality rate could potentially wipe out up to 2/5 of humanity if there wasn't a very fast and efficient vaccine rollout. There would be things in our favour though. First and foremost, we wouldn't need to invent a vaccine, as that has already been done, and smallpox doesn't mutate constantly the way other illnesses do, thereby requiring frequent amendments to the vaccine. There are also large stockpiles of vaccines in some countries, and it is unlikely that any hostile nation would deliberately release it due to the theory of mutually assured destruction. In other words, like nuclear weapons, the fallout from such a release would be uncontrollable. The country that released it would be ravaged by it too, and I think much of the globe's economy and social structure would collapse. There is no point in destroying the world just so that on the off chance you survive, you can claim to rule over the ruins. Thankfully, I think the chances of such a release are nearly nil. As I said, it only exists in 2 places, and I wouldn't expect it to naturally develop in the wild again as it did thousands of years ago. While the threat of smallpox is something that movie makers like to throw into their films sometimes for dramatic effect, I remember it getting a mention in Mission Impossible Fallout, for example, I really don't think this is something you need to lose sleep over. That brings us nicely to our question of the day, which is, do you think the remaining samples of smallpox in storage should be destroyed, and why? Let me know in the comments below, and if any of you remember getting vaccinated against smallpox, I'd be interested to hear about your experience of it. To learn about another disease which ravaged our species, and the effects of which were so severe that they continue to impact us today, watch this video on how the Black Death affects you. Or if you're still intrigued to hear what happened to Queen Caroline, try this one. I'll be back next time with something new, and until then, keep learning.